What if I told you that one of the most innovative artists of the 19th century was a Japanese woman whose name translates to Heiyu? That she briefly rose to prominence as one of Edo's most famous artists before sinking into the proverbial memory hole and languishing in near total obscurity for over 150 years. What if I told you that despite some attention in recent years, her work is still vastly underappreciated? Dear friends, it's time to talk about one of my favorite artists of all time, Katsushika Oei, the daughter of Hokusai. Welcome to Neglected by Art History, brought to you, as always, by the Better Barbarians Bureau. In this series, we look at some great artists and artworks that have been buried by time but deserve wider recognition. If you appreciate this video, please like and subscribe. I'll be posting a lot more like this. And now, Katsushika Oei, Mistress of Shadow, Bringer of Light. I've been wanting to make a video about Katsushika Oei for a long time, maybe about 6 or 7 years. Ever since I discovered this magnificent artwork of hers in a book about her father, Hokusai. Now, sadly, compared with the other artists I've looked at in this series, we don't have that many surviving artworks by Oei. Well, at least that we know of. There are significant indications that many artworks attributed to Hokusai are, in fact, by Oei. More on that later. Still, even if we just limit ourselves to a study of the works that are, without a doubt, made by Oei, those works alone have merits so profound that I won't even be able to do them justice in this video. This video is going to dwell mostly on the question, who was Katsushika Oei? And we'll examine what can be gleaned about her life, her character, and her cultural context in the floating world of Japan's Edo period. As far as I know, there are no biographical books that deal exclusively with Oei, although she does appear in many of the biographies of her father, Katsushika Hokusai. Hokusai is one of the most famous artists from Edo period Japan, and the greatness of his fame is part of the reason why his daughter's fame was eclipsed. Now, despite the lack of a biography centered on Oei, there are some very interesting works of historical fiction about her. There is a novel called The Printmaker's Daughter, also I believe released under the name The Ghost Brush, and this is by the Canadian author Katherine Govier, which I have read and enjoyed. In particular, this novel has an appendix where Govier goes into depth and detail describing the historical research she did in preparation for the novel. This appendix was very helpful to me as I prepared for this video. There is also a Japanese language manga series called Miss Hokusai, written and illustrated by Hinako Sugiura. I have not read this. In fact, I don't even know if it's available in English, but I have seen an anime film that was based on the series. The film, also called Miss Hokusai, was directed by Keiichi Hara and came out in 2015. I will admit I'm not a big fan of anime, largely because I don't like the way they draw faces, but I'm able to set that aside and still enjoy an occasional anime film, and I did enjoy Miss Hokusai. Another historical novel about Oei was published in 2016. It's called Kurara, and it's by Makate Asai. This novel also inspired a motion picture, this time with live action instead of animation. It's kind of low budget and it was made for TV, so it's not like a big cinematic release. It's called Kurara Hokusai no Musume. I'm sorry, I don't speak Japanese and I'm sure I'm going to butcher all things having to do with Japanese pronunciation in the course of this video. Anyway, it appeared on Japanese TV in 2017. And the actress who plays Oei is Aoi Miyazaki. And while she is incredibly beautiful and nice to look at, All historical accounts of Oi claimed that she was somewhat unattractive and had a very big chin, earning her the nickname Ago Ago or Chin Chin. So while it might be fun to imagine Oi looking like Aoi, this is the only surviving drawing of Oi made by somebody who actually knew her. So yeah, I'll just let you decide how you want to imagine her. Actually, wait, I was wrong. This is me coming from post-production to correct that. There's actually one more drawing that was made by someone who knew her. Her father, Hokusai. He made this little doodle of her, which was on a receipt for some artwork that they were both going to create together for a patron. So that previous drawing was made by an artist who knew her, but made this drawing after her death. And this drawing by her father would have been the only surviving drawing of her during her life. And while I'm sure it is a caricature, you can still see that he has definitely emphasized her, shall we say, strong jaw. So giving credence to that nickname, Ago Ago. Okay, so historical fiction is fun for the imagination, but it's difficult to know what parts are based on real historical accounts and what parts are just made up. Like I said, there is no biography dedicated solely to Oi, but I did find 2 academic lectures about her here on YouTube. I'll link to both in the description. The first is Katsushika Oei, a woman artist in a floating world. This one actually features Katherine Govier as one of the speakers, presenting the research that she did for her book. The other lecture is by an art historian and professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Julie Nelson Davis. Her lecture is called Katsushika Oei and the Hokusai Legacy. I've also cited from an online article she wrote for the British Museum called Hokusai and Ōi, Art Runs in the Family. Who was Katsushika Oei? She was born in the year 1800 in Tokyo, which in those days was called Edo. Her name at birth was not Oi, but Ei, and she went by Ei or Eijo. I will be referring to her by her birth name Ei or Eijo until the point when she adopts her brush name Oi later on. I've seen Oi spelled various ways, like this, and this. Sadly, I don't know much about the Japanese language, so I can't offer any insight into the process by which it is transliterated into the Roman alphabet. For this video, I'm going to go with this spelling, but just be aware that there's different ways that people have rendered her name in the Roman alphabet. By the way, the Japanese naming conventions seem to follow the Chinese model, whereby the family name is first, followed by the given personal name. So if Oi went to school in America and had her name printed on the attendance roster, it would read Oi Katsushika. Likewise, Katsushika Hokusai would be Hokusai Katsushika. Now, you probably know Hokusai's work, even if you aren't too familiar with Japanese art. He's the artist behind this famous image, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, from 1831. But Hokusai did much, much more than just that. I'm not going to get into it because I wouldn't even know where to start or where to stop, and we might run the risk of letting Oi get eclipsed by him even in a video that's supposed to be centered around her. In essence, just think of Hokusai as sort of a Picasso, an irrepressible artist whose life spanned almost a century of near ceaseless artistic output and who was constantly reinventing himself and pressing into the limits of what he could do with line and color. One of his epitaphs is, "Old man crazy about painting." I think that gives a nice impression of Hokusai's single-minded focus on art. Turning back to Ei, she was Hokusai's daughter by his second wife, Kotome, with whom he had 2 other children. He also had 3 children from his first wife. I imagine Ei would have shown a proclivity towards drawing and painting from a young age, though it seems that all of the Hokusai children were expected to help out with the various tasks in the art studio. Still, Ei's passion for art must have matched her father's in a way that marked her out as different from her siblings. As she grew, Hokusai continued to teach her until, for whatever reason, he sent her to study with another artist, an associate of his named Tsutsumi Torin III. Tsutsumi, like Hokusai, was an accomplished painter and printmaker. Why Oi went to study with him rather than just remaining under her father's tutelage is anybody's guess. As I was digging into this, it seemed like there's only one primary source that goes into any real depth about Hokusai. It is by Ijima Hanjuro, aka Ijima Kyoshin, and it was compiled in 1893, which is more than 40 years after Hokusai's death. It's called Katsushika Hokusai Den, and while Professor Nelson Davis does refer to it as a biography, Catherine Govier says it is not a formal biography, and in actuality, it's just a collection of reminiscences. I couldn't track down a copy of it, at any rate, but maybe somewhere in those pages lies the answer as to why Hokusai sent his talented daughter to study with Tsutsumi Torin. However, since I am not privy to this information and I really enjoy speculating, I'm going to indulge in some speculation right now. Okay, so maybe there were too many mouths to feed in the Katsushika household. I don't know if the Japanese system of apprenticeship includes room and board. I do know that the European apprenticeships functioned that way, so that's possible maybe. Another possibility is that maybe Hokusai was too busy to continue teaching her himself, but he realized that she had talent and wanted her to develop it to her fullest potential. I like that interpretation, and I'm going to go with that one until somebody tells me better. All right, so who is Tsutsumi Torin III? He must have been pretty damn impressive if the great Hokusai would entrust his daughter's artistic education to him. I'm sure there's all kinds of information about him online, and if I just Google search his name, oh crap, there's like next to nothing. I mean, several of his paintings are listed on various websites, so okay, at least there's that. But I couldn't find any solid information on him, on his life, or who he was. I did Google his name in Japanese, and I was comforted to know that he does at least have a Wikipedia page in Japanese, but that's not going to help me here. Still, let's look at a few of his paintings to see if there are any inferences we can draw about Eijo's artistic development under him. So, Tsutsumi Torin shows sometimes a meticulous attention to detail, and that is definitely a feature of much of Oi's mature work. Now, we can ask ourselves, well, isn't there some meticulous attention to detail in Hokusai as well? Could she not have gotten that from him? And there is, of course, but I feel like Hokusai is just much more expressive, or tends to favor expressiveness rather than meticulous attention to detail. That's definitely one way that I think Oi contrasts with her father's style. Now, I was thinking that bright color is another thing that maybe Oi got from her time with Tsutsumi Torin. Although, again, if I look back at Hokusai's work, he also has plenty of examples of bright color. So maybe that's just a bit of a projection on my part, or wishing to see these sort of similarities so I can construct this kind of narrative about this formative part of Eijo's artistic development. And yet, I do feel that when Hokusai is painting, so when he's not necessarily in his prints, but when he's painting, he does have a bit more of a reserved palette. And he does seem to be focused on, again, expressive brush strokes, values, a range of values, and a more subdued color palette. Then again, he put out so much over the course of his long life that you almost can't speak about Hokusai's tendencies as an artist, because you'll invariably probably find some sort of artwork that will contradict the generalization you're trying to make. Another thing that might be a bit of a stretch, but I don't know, I feel like it might be relevant too, is this forward-facing face, this frontal view portrait. It's interesting that it doesn't occur too often in the Ukiyo-e styles. It generally, Ukiyo-e styled portraits or depictions of faces tend to be in 3/4, not always, but they tend to be. And especially when we are looking at the sort of the fancy lady subgenre of ukiyo-e, we tend not to see them like forward facing. And it's very interesting to see this forward facing portrait in one of Ei's, or Oi's. I suppose I should refer to her as Oei when we're talking about her artwork. In one of Oi's depictions of these fancy ladies, and it just kind of stands out. It's not something that was done too often in this ukiyo-e kind of genre. Now, somebody who really knows what they're talking about will immediately point out that Kuniyoshi has lots of forward-facing depictions of faces, frontal-viewed faces, and Kuniyoshi was, a huge part of ukiyo-e. Okay, again, maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but I did find that this very interesting painting by Tsutsumi Torin has sort of a reminiscent kind of vibe to this later painting from Oei. You can't really point to it and say, oh, this definitely came from that, but I don't know, it just is, we're grasping at straws here, we might as well grasp. Just to give Tsutsumi Torin a moment of spotlight on his own, I just do want to say I love this painting. I love how expressive it is. And you can kind of get a sense in this painting of why Hokusai approved of Tsutsumi Torin enough to send his daughter to study with him. Because, yeah, this is definitely a painting that Hokusai would have approved of. Okay, now, again, people who know a lot about Japanese art are going to call me out, call my BS here, because tall, narrow compositions are very, very common in, not just in Japanese painting, also it's kind of coming from the Chinese painting tradition. This is just very standard, and I think probably most people just know it intuitively after having seen many tall, narrow compositions. However, this is a very tall, very narrow composition, and so, it does sort of strike my mind, the comparison between this one by Tsutsumi Torin and this one by Oei. And again, the negative space, the way she plays with the negative space and is not afraid to use a lot of it. I don't know. I again, grasping at straws, but it's interesting. I don't really recall seeing Hokusai go quite this tall and quite this narrow, at least most of the time. I could be wrong. Again, he put out so much. I'm sure some people who really know Hokusai's repertoire can find some examples, but for what it's worth. When you're dealing with someone like Oei, for whom there's really not that much historical information that was actually recorded about her life, you're going to end up building some castles in the sky. That's why so many people made really interesting historical fiction about her, because, you don't have those concrete details, and yet you have this very interesting character, and you kind of want to fill in some of the blanks. I definitely caught myself doing that when I was trying to construct these narratives around what she might have taken from Tsutsumi Torin, because I had originally a fifth category, which I had a hard time summarizing, but you could call it something like an eye to form, proportion, symmetry, and overall continuity of form. And I realized that I was sort of projecting this into Tsutsumi Torin a little too much, because when I stepped back and looked at his work again, I actually think he has a lot more in common with Hokusai, in the sense that he doesn't really care that much about symmetry, proportion, and a continuity of form in the same way that Oei does. So if I look at this aspect, because this aspect is definitely part of Oi, it really stands out. She has a high level of attention to the continuity of form. Again, with Hokusai or Tsutsumi Torin, you get more of the sense that expression and expressive power was something they were more concerned with than the continuity of form. The continuity of form is, of course, sort of a more Western consideration or let's say concern, right? So I think in that sense, Oi is showing almost a bit more of a kind of a Western orientation towards picture making. And maybe that makes sense in the same sense that she showed a lot more interest in light and shadow than a typical Japanese artist. Okay, let me give a huge caveat. That whole section was full of generalizations that don't quite hit the mark. But I need to make these generalizations. I'm going to keep them in this video because I think when we sort of overgeneralize these tendencies, at least it helps to bring some of these issues into focus. You can start to build what Piaget called a schema, just a sort of basic idea about who these people were and what their concerns were. But let's get back to Oi and her life. What more do we know about who she was and what her life was like? It was while she studied with Tsutsumi Torin that she met the man she was going to marry. Another of Tsutsumi's students, named Minamizawa Tomei. To make things more confusing, he is also sometimes referred to as Tsutsumi because oftentimes the artists would take the name of their master teacher. More often, they would take part of the name, so like the first syllable or so, but sometimes they also just get the whole name. I'm not really sure how this convention works, but you might read that that Oi married Tsutsumi, but they mean Tsutsumi Tomei, not Tsutsumi Torin. So I know it's confusing. But anyway, it was while she was studying with Tsutsumi Torin that she met Tomei. Well, let's just call him Tomei. They got married in 1824, and they lived happily ever after. Just kidding. They got divorced after 3 years. Apparently, Eijo made fun of him for being a bad artist. According to Julie Nelson Davis in her article, Hokusai and Ōi, Art Runs in the Family. It was rumored that they fell out after Eijo commented, apparently too critically, on Tomei's lack of skill as a painter. I can imagine that as the daughter of Hokusai, she would have had an opinion about painting. After the divorce, she moved back in with her father and helped him to run the studio. Around this time, Hokusai had a stroke. According to Catherine Govier, Eijo continued to run the studio as well as nursing him while he convalesced. To pay their living expenses, she was forced to execute many works under his name. This wouldn't have been that out of the ordinary, though. The studios of Edo typically operated in a collaborative way, where the more advanced apprentices would work alongside the master on different parts of a given artwork. In European painting, we might recall the way that Rubens ran his studio, or in contemporary times, we might think of Damien Hirst or Kehinde Wiley, or any other number of artists who act more as a creative director, while leaving the actual execution of details to the mere technicians. But I want to highlight the fact that Eijo was a dutiful daughter. She not only ran the studio for Hokusai, she simultaneously nursed him back to health. That's a lot to deal with. She had no idea if the old man would be able to recover from his stroke, but she did her best to help him. By the way, one of the scenes I liked a lot in the Japanese TV adaptation of Kurara was when one of Hokusai's creative rivals comes to visit him during the period when his recovery still seems uncertain, if not doubtful. The rival, a famous author named Takizawa Bakin, denigrates Hokusai to his face, but in a way calculated to inspire Hokusai's wrath to kindle in him, and so to kindle that fighting spirit and will to live. I'm not sure if that scene has any historical basis, but I like it. Anyway, It was Eijo who really got Hokusai through his stroke. Eventually, he made a full recovery. Sadly, though, her mother, Kotome, died in 1828, not long after she began caring for her father. It was sometime around this period when A became Oi. What's in a name? Names vary in importance from culture to culture. In modern America, your name typically is just a sequence of syllables that your parents liked the sound of. In other cultures, choosing a name is often more important, and the meaning is, meaningful. I can't speak to how modern Japan is oriented with regards to naming conventions, but I can tell you that Hokusai, as an individual, was obsessed with the power of names. His own birth name had been Tokitaro, but over his long life, he would rename himself often. My sense is that this was sort of a ritualistic way of reinventing himself and resetting his intention in life and as an artist. It wasn't that uncommon for artists to do this. Even in the West, it's not uncommon for an artist or actor to use a stage name or pen name. But for Hokusai, it was a particular fixation. According to Google Arts and Culture, Hokusai was known by at least 30 different names during his lifetime, more than any other artist of his era. He first published a series of work in 1779, which were released under the name Shunro, given by his first master, Shunsho. Later in life, he referred to himself as Gakkyo Ronin Manji, the old man mad about art. His names were often used to identify the different styles and different periods of his artistic production. In the period when Eijo changed her name to Oi, Hokusai was painting under the name Iitsu. According to Ijima, many of the works put out under the name Iitsu were actually made by Oi. Now, we will come back to this later when I deal with the issue of attribution, because what Ijima is alleging here is no small thing. Apparently, it is a very controversial topic in academic circles, judging by the hushed tones in which the subject is broached. But I don't want to focus on that right now. In my opinion, just the works that we know for sure were made by Oi, the ones that bear her signature, are enough to establish her as a genius of the highest order. We don't know the exact dates for a lot of these works, but we can imagine that she would have started making them alongside her other work, the work she did for the Hokusai studio. That is to say, as she worked in collaboration with her father or her father's various students and assistants, she also began to take commissions of her own and perhaps even made a few of these works for her own pleasure. She wanted a brush name, a name to establish herself as a serious artist. Now, at the outset of this video, I said her name means "Hey You." Well, it does phonetically, but not as written. The story of how she chose her name is actually pretty amusing, and it reveals a lot about her character. To illustrate this, let me return to the article by Julie Nelson Davis. "Oi, oi," shouted Hokusai. "Hey, hey you." "Hey, hey," his daughter Eijo replied, with a cheeky grin, sang out like a street caller. "Old man, how about it?" Every time I think about this exchange between Hokusai and Eijo, I find myself amused at how cheeky she was. To call out Oi in Japanese was then, as it is now, very informal and even rather impolite. When she replied with the lyric of a street caller soliciting sales from passers-by, she must have been taking the mickey. Hokusai seems to have often called out Oi, oi when he wanted her. So Eijo used the characters that replicated the sound of the word Oi into an artistic name for herself, meaning loyal to Iitsu. She was referring to the name Hokusai used after he turned 60, Iitsu, meaning one again. With this new name, she turned something kind of disrespectful, that "hey you," into something that showed her deep connection to Hokusai, and she often signed her work with this name. So there you have it. The actual meaning of her name was loyal to Iitsu, her father, but had the intentionally ironic connotation of hey you, while simultaneously conforming to the tradition of an artist's name taking one syllable from their master. This one little name, Oi, has so many layers of meaning compressed into it with so much of Oi's personality. She is a dutiful daughter. She is loyal to her father, preferring to live with him and help him manage the family business rather than attempting to get married again. Simultaneously, she can be crass and snide. What a gross thing to say to one's father, even as a joke. But it reveals a way that the two of them really were like a pair of renegades, much the same way that we conceive of the artistic rebel today, the bohemian types that slough off the social norms and societal expectations of their day in a single-minded pursuit of artistic perfection. And I don't mean to project this present-day character archetype onto the past. But hey, if the shoe fits, wear it. Ijima's book claims that Oi and her father could not be bothered with menial chores like cleaning the house, and so the house was always just a mess with dishes left unwashed in piles as the two of them focused intensely on their artwork. Apparently, they lived on takeout, which was actually an option in Edo at that time, because even cooking food was too bothersome a task for Oi and her father. So I can imagine that there are three camps related to the question of which artworks are definitely by Oi, which are by Hokusai, and which they may have collaborated on. One camp is that of the entrenched status quo, seeking to minimize the hand of Oi in any artworks currently attributed to Hokusai. An opposing camp is the revisionist camp that wants to kind of almost denigrate Hokusai by asserting that Oi was behind every great artwork he made in the last 20 years of his life. Maybe Oi was responsible for the Great Wave off Kanagawa. A third camp, though, we could imagine as reconciliatory, seeking to gently pull out the evidence of Oi's hand from artworks where it can be reasonably identified. And that is the camp where I'd pitch my tent, because I do respect Hokusai immensely, and I do think it would be a shame to try to denigrate the huge impact of his importance and the grand legacy of this larger than life character. I love it. I love the legacy. I love the legend. And I don't think that we need to make him smaller just by making Oi bigger. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead and segue now into looking at Oi's art. I've divided her paintings into three little groupings that we're going to sort of look at separately. The first is the Bijin-ga, that is the fancy ladies or the beautiful ladies that she was very well known for. The second is going to be a brief look at some of her early works. And then we're going to finish up with the 5 artworks that are, in my opinion, her masterpieces. Now, before we get into it, I do just want to mention something about the time frame here. You will see specific years attributed to some of these online sometimes, but I don't know where these are coming from. I haven't seen any evidence that anyone really knows any specific years for any of these artworks by Oi. Sometimes you'll see a spread of years from like 1820 to 1850, and that's more or less the time when she was active as an artist in her adult life. Okay, so beautiful women paintings. Oi is known to have excelled at this particular genre. In fact, Hokusai himself admitted that he could not compete with Oi's skill in rendering of beautiful women. Here we see a courtesan with so many layers of clothing that she's almost tripping over her own opulence. And taken together, you can see that they reinforce what I was saying earlier in the video when I talked about meticulous attention to detail. Oi has a very smooth and steady hand, very smooth brushwork with the color fills, and just kind of an insane level of almost machine-like precision when she's executing the patterns in the fabrics. Very rich colors, very beautiful color palettes. A sense that she's really considered the continuity of form. Remember that term that I was repeating ad nauseum earlier on? You sometimes get the sense with these fancy ladies that their arms and face just emerge out of an abstract space. The kimono in some of them is like its own abstract artwork, and the arms and face just sort of emerge from it. And yet with Oi, you really do sense the solidity of these women, the content that these arms are leading to the rest of the body. And that's what I mean when I talk about the continuity of form. There's also a sense in this particular painting called hand dancing of just an incredible grace. And speaking of hands, the long fingers, the long tapering fingers of Oi's figures are one of the key ways that art historians think we can identify some of Oi's works in cases where the attribution is not so clear. Look at this bowl of morning glories. You can see the tiny little details on the blue and white porcelain. Again, this meticulous attention to detail, this smoothness and steadiness of her hand, bold, confident color, it's all there. And notice how the folds in the dark kimono are given a treatment of light and shadow, subtle as it may be, still more than I'm used to seeing in the typical Bijin-ga. Look at the blue and red alternating pattern, that gorgeous fabric, and the coy expression of the woman slightly hiding behind her fan. Now let's take a brief look at some of her earlier works, which includes some works that were most likely made in collaboration with others of her father's apprentices in the Hokusai studio. I've also lumped this one in with the rest of these, not because it's necessarily an early work. I don't know if we know the date on this one. And I don't believe this one is a collaboration. This is just Oi. I lumped it in with the rest just because, in my opinion, this is one of Oi's subpar works, and I thought it was interesting just to briefly touch on it. One of the curious ones is this example of what's called ranga, which is Western style, and let's put Western style in quotes, Western style paintings. And in the movie Kurara, they show these as having been commissioned by a Dutch trader. And so they were made for Europeans, probably Europeans who wanted something that felt Japanese, but also had a little more of what they were used to in terms of roundness of the form, using a little bit of chiaroscuro, not very much, as you can see. But it's interesting to consider how this exposure to this different painting style may have set up Oi to be thinking about painting in a different way from other Japanese artists of that time that would go on to produce some very interesting things later. But again, in my opinion, these ranga I don't find them very pleasing personally. And then we have the shunga, which is the Japanese ukiyo-e erotica, basically like porn. But this is another interesting case where Oi is not really at her best, and it's also hinted at in the movie Kurara that she was not successful at making good shunga because apparently, she herself lacked the experience that would have, been needed to make these very, satisfying pictures. And I have no idea, if that's true. And I don't even know if these really are by Oi. The only place that I've seen these attributed to Oi is on the website Fuji Arts. And this appears to be a website dedicated to selling prints, original prints. That is, actual woodblock prints. So I'm just going to be a little tentative on that. If you are associated with Fuji Arts and you know the process by which these were attributed to Oi, please drop a comment. Let me know. I would love to learn more about, how it was arrived at that these were in fact by Oi. And again, they may be. So, it is known that she worked on some shunga, and perhaps these are those. And I said I'd briefly touch on this landscape of Mount Fuji with bamboo. The reason that I don't like it very much is just that I find the composition to be a bit scattered, and I don't see this kind of structure that would make this really a masterful composition. Certainly, I don't imagine it is a work that Hokusai would have approved of, because he was all about structure and composition and coming up with ingenious compositional devices. But it is a pretty pixelated image, and maybe if I were to see it in a higher resolution, I would be able to appreciate other aspects of it. But enough of that. Let's get to the really good stuff. These are Oi's masterworks. They're the artworks that I've been dying to tell you about. So without further ado, let's jump right in. This one is called Beauty Fulling Cloth by the Moonlight. The woman appears to be lower class, more like a peasant. And it's kind of cool that the Bijin-ga genre does include women from all types of different social classes. And this particular one, I don't know, it's sort of mysterious and beautiful, the way that you have this sort of alternating focus on the more decorative patterns in some parts of the fabric, with the plainer sort of fabric on the upper part of the torso, this interesting kind of headscarf that she's wearing, and the action, the sense of vigor in her arm as it's raised, about to come down in the action of fulling the cloth. It feels like an action that requires a lot of strength, and maybe we can read something into this from the kind of the feel that Oi may have had as a woman in Edo period Japan, occupying this role as an artist, a role that is generally reserved for men, but that she's able to fulfill to such a high degree. So, maybe, there's some sort of sense of like ennobling this peasant woman, raising her up, lifting up the action that she's doing to something of almost a heroic status. You almost can see that arm lifted as a sort of like, almost an echo of the way that the samurai is lifting his sword. And just returning again to what a sense of beauty Oi had, what a sense of appreciation for women's beauty, for feminine beauty. She really seems to delight in it and delight in depicting it. Look at the wood grain here. What delicacy. And, I speak a lot about her attention, meticulous attention to detail, her sort of loving, smooth craft work in the brush strokes of refined details. And I really feel like the wood grain, both in the instrument used for the fulling and the rack that's holding the cloth, it really showcases her attention to detail, her meticulous detail. And it sort of reminds me of the wood grain in this earlier Ranga artwork, and kind of, I think, buttresses the idea that she was heavily involved in the production of that ranga that came out at an earlier point from her father's studio. And then lastly, I did mention her use of negative space earlier on in this video. I really find that pleasing, this balance between the positive and negative. This is something that you see in many Japanese paintings. It's coming from the Chinese painting tradition, this emphasis on the alternating between the positive and the negative. Western artists typically were less comfortable with empty, negative space. But from a very early point in East Asian art, you see this very sophisticated comfort and ease with juxtaposing the blank with the full, the empty and the positive. Very, very cool the way that it's done here. To me, it seems to it exudes a sense of confidence when an artist can pull it off, and I think she's pulled it off very well. This one's called Three Women Playing Musical Instruments, a very matter-of-fact title. Remember, a lot of these titles aren't set in stone, and you might see minor variations of them in different places. What a gorgeous composition. Let's look at it just visually, formally for a moment, and then I'll try to dissect the meaning a little bit based on what can be gleaned from an academic source. Now, I mentioned before the sort of unusual compositional choice of the forward-facing face of the figure in the upper left-hand corner, but I should also mention the figure seated at the bottom of the page closest to us. The choice to portray this woman from behind so that we see the nape of her neck as her face tilts down. We see a little indication of her ear. This is also a very unusual compositional choice, a very unusual angle for artists of Oi's time. The figure on the right-hand side has the more usual three-quarters view that we are used to seeing in Bijin-ga. So taken together, these three figures depict something very, very characteristic of Oi's style. And that is a simultaneous adherence to traditional canons, traditional ways of depicting subject matter in Japanese painting, alongside an extremely ambitious streak where she feels like constantly challenging the limits of what she's comfortable with, what she can do. She is more innovative than your average Japanese artist of that time, while still existing within the mainstream sort of paradigm of Japanese aesthetics in painting. Another thing to notice here are those characteristic long tapering fingers that we talked about from before. You can see them very clearly here. And I think it speaks to Oi's love of feminine beauty in the form of gracefulness, elegance, which is kind of funny when you think about the fact that Oei herself didn't seem to embody these things. Or maybe she did. I mean, we're basing most of what we know about her on like one sort of biography by Ijima, which isn't even about her, but her father. So we don't really know. Maybe she was very graceful in her mannerisms. However, her kind of bohemian rebellious attitude does come through in this painting in the way she chose to sign her name. Apparently, it says Miss Tipsy, which was one of her artistic aliases. We know that she liked to smoke and she liked to drink, so she seems to have had a bit of rock and roll in her soul. So to get a little bit more information on this artwork, I watched a very short little YouTube video by Dr. Sarah Thompson for a recent showing of this that took place at the Seattle Art Museum. If you'd like the unregurgitated facts from her, you can watch that. I'll go ahead and link it into the video description. According to Dr. Thompson, what we are looking at here is a group of three very different women from very different social classes, or social stations, maybe we should say. The one in the front with the most magnificent robe is a courtesan, so like a very high-level prostitute. However, it's very important to remember that prostitution did not have the sorts of connotations that it has in Western culture at that time. So Dr. Thompson says she is seen more like a trendsetter with her fabulous fashions and almost like kind of like a pop star status. The musical instrument she is playing is called a koto, and I will include a bit of how it sounds here. The woman to her right is a geisha. Now, I think that a lot of people in the West get geisha confused with courtesan, and a geisha is a different type of entertainer. She might work at the brothel, but her job is to entertain the guests while they wait or after they have gone with their courtesan, and maybe they're just relaxing in one of the common rooms. Entertaining with music, with poetry. She's supposed to be cultured, learned. And Dr. Thompson says that they were required to dress more plainly than the courtesans. She's playing a shamisen, which sounds like this. Now, the third instrument is called a kokyu. I thought it might sound like a Chinese erhu, but it actually sounded more like a Western-style violin when I looked it up on YouTube. So feel free to Google it or look it up if you want to hear what it sounds like. The figure who plays it, according to Dr. Thompson, is a town girl or the daughter of a prosperous merchant. I'm not sure how she knows that. I assume it has something to do with an indication from the type of clothing that she's wearing, how she's presenting herself. But anyway, she says that in reality, she probably wouldn't have been seen in this company. And so the scene is sort of an imaginative one because it's bringing together these three different women, two of who may have been seen together, the courtesan and the geisha, but the third who wouldn't typically be in this environment. So what significance that had to a woman like Oi, who was sort of skating in between flouting convention and sticking to convention, that's an interesting line of inquiry, I think. And going back to the formal aspects of this artwork, it hardly needs to be said, but oh my God, the patterns on these kimonos, the especially the courtesan in the front. Wow. The alternating red and blue butterflies, the yellow and black stripes, just so interesting, so intricate. You really see Oi reveling in intricacy of detail. Interesting little side note, in the movie Kurara, they have this kind of cool scene where the director has imagined the moment where Oi conceives of this scene, where she gets the idea, and it's in this historical fictionalized version of course, we don't know that this happened, but in this fictionalized version, she sees these women playing, who are introduced to her by a fellow artist named Kasai Eisen. Okay, of the 5 great artworks that were made by Oi, there are 3 that in particular, I rank these as just masterpieces on another level. These are my 3 favorite artworks from Oi. This is the first of them, and it is called Hua Tuo Operating on Guan Yu's Arm. It is a Chinese folktale or historical account. I'm not sure which. At any rate, it's a story from China that is being illustrated here. And you can see Hua Tuo here, who is an old man. He's very focused on what he's doing, while some of the other men around him are recoiling and cringing, unable to bear the sight of the gore. Meanwhile, the general is calmly
observing a game of Go that he's playing with the figure in the foreground. And behind him, there is Guan Yu's son, Guan Ping, who is just sort of dispassionately observing the scene, which probably is meant to indicate the more noble sort of mind frame of Guan Yu and his son as these sort of upstanding warrior elites. Julie Nelson Davis places this artwork in the 1840s, so I'll go with that. It was obviously made by a commission, and the amount of time and attention and detail that went into this, it couldn't have been made for anything other than a very high price, a very important commission. And the signature, specifically indicating Oi, is a sign that, she was sought out on purpose by somebody who wanted Oi, not Hokusai, to be the artist fulfilling this commission. You can see this attention to detail, this meticulous and loving attention to detail that you see throughout Oi's overture, as well as what I've called the continuity of form. Look at the way that the bench is just sort of lovingly crafted and juxtaposed to the side that's closest with the side that's farther. I don't mean to indicate that Japanese artists of the time weren't capable of this sort of thing in general. They just didn't tend to give quite this level of solidity and continuity and regularity in a lot of the forms the way that Oi does. She really does seem to hold these objects in her mind in a very sort of 3D, very clear way, and in really revels in the struggle to articulate these forms in a very clear, very solid way. And again, contrasting it with that Ranga style, it's interesting that when the Japanese were intentionally trying to imitate Western styles, it's not very pleasing. But here, this is something completely different. This is a Japanese artist working within the Japanese tradition with some similar considerations, some similar, let's say, like aesthetic values, but and when I say similar, I mean similar to Western aesthetic values, but approaching it from a completely different angle. Again, we see this like what's basically essentially a still life in the background here. And, so again, it's sort of something that you see more commonly in Western art, but given this loving attention to detail, and yet it never stops feeling like something that exists wholly and comfortably within the Japanese aesthetic overall. Really just an amazing artwork. And that's just the formal aspects. I mean, I didn't even talk about the composition, which is just really masterfully laid out, but that's just the formal aspects. What about the meaning? What about the implications? What about what it does to you psychologically to see this graphic story? I've seen some authors suggest that there may be political implications here. I'm not really big on reading politics into art that deeply. It's just a personal thing, I guess. But I mean, I feel like even if there were some veiled sort of political allusions to things going on in Edo at that time, I think I don't know. For me, I think there's deeper meaning here, just in the sort of allegory that's being presented to us, in the sense of the juxtaposition between these characters who are composed and able to stoically handle this situation with those characters who are cringing and cowering in fear and disgust. And I find it fascinating that this was made by a woman. Again, like Oi is showing her strength here as she confronts and depicts this gory subject matter. And yet, yeah, she's just embraced it fully, like going forward with this very brutal, gory scene, almost reveling in it. How common was work like this in the 1840s, work depicting this level of gore? I'm not an expert, but I have looked at thousands of images of Ukiyo-e, and I don't see a lot of work this bloody from that period. The work of Kuniyoshi is very violent, but it's not really that bloody. The work of Kunisada does occasionally get this gory. So I don't want to say that it's unheard of. I just want to emphasize that it is unusual and it sort of marks Oi out as an innovator. Like her father, she's not afraid to stand out from the crowd to try new and different things. By the Meiji era, Japanese art will occasionally be very bloody. It will be more bloody than it was during this period. But where the Meiji art often feels gratuitous when it's being this bloody, this artwork uses the blood and gore in service of a deeper meaning. Okay, we have arrived. We are here. This is my favorite artwork by Katsushika Ōi, the artwork that first got me hooked, interested, fascinated, and wanting to know more. I don't think I can possibly say everything I want to. I know I can't say everything I want to say about this artwork in the time frame that I've got, but let's just go over a few things that I think make this a phenomenal artwork. First, though, I better tell you the title. This is another one of those paintings where I've seen a lot of different titles on a lot of different websites, so I am going to give you the title that is listed on the museum website. It's currently housed at the Menard Art Museum in Japan, and the English translation that is given for the title is Girl Composing a Poem Under the Cherry Blossoms in the Night. Now, even if this artwork wasn't an incredibly innovative artwork, almost a one of a kind for its time and place, it would still be an incredible artwork for its composition, the beauty and delicacy with which it was rendered, the subtle color palette, the restricted color palette, this beautiful alternating between the white, the black, and the red, and the yellow. And yet, add to that the fact that this is perhaps the first ever depiction of light and shadow in such a strong way, in this way that's almost like Western chiaroscuro. The first, I think, ever in the history of Japanese art. The first, let's say the first that wasn't Ranga or, one of these emulations of Western painting, which of course there were a few dating way back to the 1600s when Western traders began to first come into contact with Japan. But what you're seeing here is totally unlike those Ranga pictures or those copies of Western pictures that other Japanese artists had done prior to this. This is totally new. This has never been done before because this is the Japanese style incorporating light and shadow in a way that is both scientific and accurate and yet totally Japanese. This is not just absorbing some Western influence and imposing it in an uncomfortable way into a Japanese aesthetic, the way that those Ranga pictures do. This is rather a uniquely Japanese expression of the unique Japanese aesthetic, but using strong light and shadow in a way that had never been done before. I really want to emphasize how hard this is to do. I'm an artist and a teacher, and I know both from having tried it myself and having seen students attempt to unify art styles that use a flat aesthetic and art styles that use a modeled chiaroscuro aesthetic, how difficult it is to try to unite those two different worlds. They just don't tend to combine very well. And that is why you tend not to see too much ambitious use of light and shadow in art styles that revolve around an aesthetic that is flat, that utilizes outline and solid fills. That aesthetic is not limited to Japan. You see it in ancient Egyptian painting. You see it in Mayan painting. You see it in the painting traditions of many different places, many different times. In fact, you even see it very late in the Western tradition in the Art Nouveau pictures of Alphonse Mucha. Mucha uses some modeling of light to dark to show the roundness of forms, but it's very restricted. Overall, his sense of figure is very flat, bounded by outline, an aesthetic that is very hard to combine with light and shadow in a favorable way, in a way that makes sense. They're just two different languages, two different visual languages that do not tend to combine well together. Do you know how ambitious an artist needs to be to attempt something like what we are looking at here? It's really on another level. I can't emphasize it enough. And yet, she didn't just attempt it, she succeeded. That's what blew my mind the first time I saw this. She succeeded in uniting these two disparate approaches into a unified whole, into something that doesn't feel like a mishmash. Light and shadow here play perfectly into the native Japanese aesthetic. And as ambitious as this was, she went on to even outdo herself with the next painting, Night Scene in the Yoshiwara. I really just want to impress this upon you, that if she had only made these two paintings, if this was all that Katsushika Oei had ever created, or all that was left of what she had created, if these were the only two paintings that we could for sure say were made by Katsushika Oei, she would still be one of the most important, most innovative, most creative artists who ever lived on planet Earth, let alone within the Japanese painting tradition. If we're just talking about Japanese art, you will not see this level of scientific complexity and rigor in the depiction of light and shadow until the emergence of Shin-hanga in 1915. Shin-hanga is a Japanese woodblock print tradition that marries a lot of Western technique with those native Japanese traditions. But even it is it's different than this. It's not the same thing. Shin-hanga really is a unity and a blending of Eastern and Western art styles and aesthetic considerations, whereas this is uniquely and wholly and completely Japanese. I'm getting too excited. I need to calm down, but I haven't heard anyone ever articulate this before about Katsushika Oei. So maybe I'm excited because I feel like I'm one of the first people to articulate this clearly. I can't be the first person to have thought these thoughts. I can't see how anyone could look at these artworks and not notice how starkly they contrast with all that came before, and even sadly all that came after. Like, how did this fail to not initiate a revolution in Japanese art in the middle of the 1800s. And yet it didn't. It didn't. You will see artists like, Hiroshige using more and more contrasting with simple shadows and sort of simple light logic. It will get more sophisticated than it was, but it will never approach this level of complexity. It's like I said, not until like Shinhanga or like isolated instances in the Meiji era where Japanese artists are actually abandoning the Japanese aesthetic canon and completely embracing Western painting styles. But again, that is not this. That is not what we are looking at here. And so it is so unique. It is so noteworthy. It is so worthy of comment, of study, it is, I don't know, to me, it is so important. I haven't even started to analyze this painting. So, night scene in the Yoshiwara. The Yoshiwara is the pleasure district, the district where the prostitutes are, the houses of pleasure. And here you see people gathered around looking into one of these houses of pleasure. I can't think of a nicer name than the name is escaping me for what you call this. Anyway, very interesting again to think about the differences in the time and the place, Edo, what it meant, what did prostitution mean to someone like Oi, who grew up obviously seeing it around her. It occupies this place in Edo society where these women are sort of looked up to and looked down on simultaneously for different reasons. And yet, yeah, I think I don't have the cultural sophistication to even comment on this artwork and give it the depth that it deserves. But there is so much subtlety in terms of meaning and implication in this artwork, not only because of the subject matter alone, but because of who is making it. A woman's perspective on female beauty, on appreciating it and maybe being intimidated by it, just the way that these men seem to be intimidated as they look through from a distance. There's the implication of a cage, the bars that they're looking through. These women are sort of encaged in this life, trapped in this life. There's the implication of the spectacle, what a spectacle they are in both positive and negative. But think about the positive for a moment. These beautiful things put up on this strange sort of pedestal, the attraction, the revulsion, everything that goes along with it. Some people have commented on the fact that you can't really see any of the faces of these women except for the one at the very end. So there's all kinds of interesting implications, psychological dynamics going on in this artwork. And then a really fun thing that Oi has done, she's placed the letters of her name on the lanterns scattered throughout the painting. So again, I told you how important names were at this time and place, and especially to Hokusai and to Oi. So just very interesting. I mean, she must have been aware that what she had done in the creation of this artwork was something that had never been done in the history of Japanese painting. And so, placing her name throughout these lanterns is sort of a playful way of almost boasting or being proud of this incredible feat that she has pulled off. It's a shame. It's a crime that this artwork is not more known and celebrated and lauded in every book on Japanese art history. So what happened to Katsushika Ōi? Why is she not more known? Why didn't she go down in the history books as this amazing, innovative artist that she was? Obviously, she was a woman in a time and place when being a woman was not conducive to being a celebrated artist, since the gender roles were pretty firm and being an artist was just not a role that society at large was expecting a woman to fulfill. Now, that's not to say that she didn't have some fame. She actually was regarded as the most famous artist in Edo for at least 1 year. In 1847, she was commissioned to illustrate a book called Illustrated Handbook for Daily Life for Women. This book went on to be a stellar success, and Ōi was referred to by at least one historical reference as the most famous artist in Edo after the publication of that book. Now, it's kind of ironic that she gained so much recognition from a book that chronicles all the sort of stereotypical roles of women in society at that time, since she herself did not seem to embody any of those stereotypical behaviors. And in fact, Iijima criticizes her as having a masculine, domineering nature, saying she could paint, but she could not sew. So she didn't seem to embody any of these feminine standards that that she illustrated in the book. And yet she does seem to have had a sensitive appreciation for feminine beauty, so maybe we shouldn't be so surprised. Here's a conundrum. Without Hokusai, Ōi may have never learned how to draw and paint. She certainly would have never had the opportunity to practice it as a career, and yet by the same token, it was the burning sun of Hokusai's great fame that prevented her own brilliant star from being seen by history. Well, at least for the past 150 years, the efforts of academics like Julie Nelson Davis and novelists like Katherine Govier, Makate Asai, Hinako Sugiura, as well as the directors who have adapted their books to the screen, they are slowly starting to lift Ōi out of the shadows, and I hope that my own small contribution with this video will help as well. But it is interesting to note that in the years immediately following Hokusai's death, Ōi was not forgotten. She was one of the most famous artists in Edo. So how does someone that is recorded as being one of the most popular artists of Edo slip into such a complete obscurity? It's probably a very complex answer. I'm sure it involves no small amount of misogyny, but at any rate, the last piece of historical information we have on Ōi is very dark. It's from a memory recounted by her niece Tachi, and I will quote it from the appendix of Katherine Govier's book, The Printmaker's Daughter. Tachi was a girl when Ōi vanished. She is the only woman who actually knew Ōi whose views are recorded. 30 years after her aunt's disappearance, Tachi was kind to the memory. She said, "Hokusai was crazy, and the only way to live with him was to be crazy too." Her version of the disappearance was succinct and eloquent. In the summer of Ansai 4, 1857, a man called Bunzo invited her to paint the inn at Totsuka. Ōi put her brushes in her sleeve pocket and went out. Since then, she has been missing. It's chilling, and it sounds like something very bad may have happened to her. But I don't want to leave this video off on such a dark note. Ōi was the artist who brought light to Japanese painting, and that is what she should be remembered for. Thanks so much for watching. If you appreciated this video, please just like and subscribe. That's all I'm asking for at this point. I really hope to grow this channel to a size that can justify maybe quitting one of the jobs that I'm currently working so that I can dedicate more time to this. But yeah, I've got quite a far way to go, so I'd really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe to help me get there. Thank you so much, and ciao for now.